The Ancient Astronaut Theory is more accurately described as a hypothesis. A hypothesis is either a suggested explanation for an observable phenomenon or a reasoned prediction of a possible causal correlation among multiple phenomena. In science, a theory is a tested, well-substantiated unifying explanation for a set of verified proven factors. A theory is always backed by evidence. A hypothesis is only a suggested possible outcome and is testable and falsifiable. As such, the name Ancient Astronaut Hypothesis is more appropriate. If the average person were asked when in our history did the notion of extraterrestrial intervention first appear, most would undoubtedly say in the works of fiction in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In fact, check out what Wikipedia has listed under the heading Hypothesis Origins. Quote, paleo-contact or ancient astronaut narratives first appeared in the early science fiction of the late 19th to early 20th century. End quote. Needless to say, like many other things on Wikipedia, this is far from correct. The true origin actually goes back several millennia. Before we begin our analysis, it is important to outline a concise definition for the hypothesis which accurately represents its modern disposition. In the simplest form, the hypothesis states at some point in Earth's distant past, in one form or another, an intervention occurred from an extraterrestrial source. However, this basic definition allows for many variants. In fact, the most basic form of the hypothesis has allowed for some rather strange and outlandish claims to evolve in the pop culture in particular. Even in the field of science, the concept of pans-permia can fall under this hypothesis. It holds that life on Earth was seeded from space and that life's evolution to higher forms depends on genetic programs that come from space. It also accepts the Darwinian account of evolution that does not require new genetic programs. It is a wholly scientific, testable theory for which evidence is accumulating. So, for our purposes, we shall refine the definition in order to focus on the more genuine form of the hypothesis. For more serious proponents, the definition includes an explanation of the exact type of extraterrestrial intervention, namely the external manipulation of human DNA causing an acceleration of our evolution. This nuance has also led many in this school of thought to rename the concept as intervention theory. Those in this field of study who consider themselves serious researchers hold this distinction as one of the primary tenets of the hypothesis. But, in the beginning, the hypothesis did not originally possess its modern nuances. In this analysis, we are not attempting to evaluate the ancient civilizations that wrote of gods coming down from the sky and interacting with our ancestors. The Sumerian, Egyptian, and Indus Valley civilization, among others, all have such accounts dating back several thousands of years. And these accounts represent some of the more tangible pieces of evidence for the modern version of the hypothesis. However, we are focused here on individuals in history who used this collective memory, if you will, to formulate a defined concept that could be evaluated externally through logic and reason. Anaxagoras was a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher who lived from 500 to 420 BC. He was a member of what is now often called the Ionian school of philosophy. Anaxagoras wrote a book of philosophy, but only fragments of the first part have survived. The first known mention of the concept of pans-permia was in his writings, although his concept differs from the modern theory. Quote, all things have existed from the beginning, but originally they existed in infinitesimally small fragments of themselves, endless in number, and inextricably combined. All things existed in this mass, but in a confused and indistinguishable form. There were the seeds or miniatures of wheat and flesh and gold in the primitive mixture, but these parts, of like nature with their wholes, had to be eliminated from the complex mass before they could receive a definite name and character." End quote. We start with Anaxagoras because his initial concept of pans-permia later evolved into a more refined version that falls squarely within the confines of intervention theory. Even so, Anaxagoras was in the minority, and it was Aristotle's school of thought that won out during this time and for many centuries to come. Aristotle believed the Earth was the innermost sphere in a universe or world surrounded by various other spheres containing the moon, sun, planets, and stars. Those heavenly spheres, crystalline and transparent, rotated about the earthly core comprising 4 elements: fire, air, water, and earth. Those elements layered themselves based on their essence or nature. Earth's natural place was at the middle of the cosmos, which was why solid matter fell to the ground, seeking the inaccessible center far below. Based on this principle, Aristotle deduced the impossibility of other worlds. If some other worlds existed, its matter, or its earth, would seek both the center of its world and of our world as well. Such opposite imperatives posed a logical contradiction which Aristotle, having invented logic, regarded as a direct personal insult. He also applied further reasoning to point out that there is no space, or void, outside the known world for any other world to occupy. So, Aristotle concluded, 2 worlds cannot both exist. So much for logic, huh? For well over 1,000 years, there seemed to be very little debate regarding the possibility of other worlds. This was probably a result of the pervasiveness of church philosophy and its rigid opposition to the idea of the plurality of worlds. So we skip ahead to the 13th century in the Common Era, when Aristotle's writings were rediscovered in medieval Europe, and most scholars continue to defend his position. But ironically, this time around, it was religion that leveled the philosophical playing field. In 1277, the Bishop of Paris banned scholars from teaching 219 principles, many associated with Aristotle's philosophy. Among the prohibited teachings on the list was item 34, that God could not create as many worlds as he wanted to. Since the penalty for violating this decree was excommunication, Parisian scholars suddenly discovered rationales allowing multiple worlds, empowering God to defy Aristotle's logic. While many philosophers asserted that God could make many worlds, most intimated that he probably wouldn't have bothered. Hardly anyone addressed the likelihood of alien life, although both John Buridan in Paris and William of Ockham in Oxford did consider the possibility. God could produce an infinite number of individuals of the same kind as those that now exist, wrote Ockham, but he is not limited to producing them in this world. On a side note, it is more than ironic that Occam's razor is used by many critics and debunkers of the ancient astronaut hypothesis. We are certain that the use of his principle by such critics and debunkers is done so with complete ignorance of Occam's belief in unlimited worlds and infinite numbers of individuals. The first really explicit deviation from orthodoxy occurred during the Inquisition in Europe in the mid-15th century. Populated worlds showed up more prominently in writings by the renegade thinkers such as Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, who wrote a book called Of Learned Ignorance, in which he stated, quote, "Rather than think so many stars and parts of the heavens are uninhabited, and that this earth of ours alone is peopled, we will suppose that in every region there are inhabitants, differing in nature by rank, and all owing their origin to God. Considering how little we know about other animals here on earth, of the inhabitants of worlds other than our own we can know still less, having no standards by which to appraise them." End quote. Giordano Bruno argued not only for the existence of other worlds, but also for worlds inhabited by beings just like, or maybe better than, Earth's humans. Bruno, an Italian friar, asserted that God's perfection demanded an infinity of worlds and beings. Infinite perfection is far better presented in innumerable individuals than in those which are numbered and finite, he argued. Moving to the late 1600s, we find the prominent Dutch scientist Christian Huygens, who pointed out, quote, "A man that is of Copernicus's opinion that this earth of ours is a planet, like the rest of the planets, cannot but sometimes think that it's not improbable that the rest of the planets have their inhabitants too." End quote. In 1686, Frenchman Bernard Le Bouvier de Fontenelle had surveyed the prospects for life in the solar system in his Conversations on the Plurality of Worlds, an imaginary dialogue between a philosopher and an uneducated but intelligent woman known as the Marquise. It would be very strange that the Earth was as populated as it is and the other planets weren't at all, the philosopher told the Marquise. Although he didn't think people could live on the Sun, he sided with those who envisioned inhabitants on other planets and even the Moon. Emanuel Swedenborg was a Swedish engineer, scientist, and most prominently a theologian. In his work, Earths in the Universe, Swedenborg states, quote, "Anyone with a sound intellect can know from many considerations that there are numerous worlds with people on them. Rational thought leads to the conclusion that massive bodies such as the planets, some of which are larger than our own Earth, are not empty masses created merely to wander aimlessly around the sun and shine with their feeble light on one planet. No, they must have a much greater purpose than that. What would one planet be to God, who is infinite, and for whom thousands or even tens of thousands of planets, all full of inhabitants, would be such a trifling matter as to be almost nothing." End quote. The pans-permia theory was rekindled in the 19th century by the scientists Lord Kelvin William Thomson, Jöns Jakob Berzelius, and Hermann von Helmholtz. Lord Kelvin declared in 1871, quote, "We must regard it as probable in the highest degree that there are countless seed-bearing meteoric stones moving about through space. If at the present instance no life existed upon this earth, one such stone falling upon it might, but what we blindly call natural causes leads it to becoming covered with vegetation." End quote. Some scholars argue that in the works of Helena Blavatsky, we find the first modern version of the ancient astronaut hypothesis. Blavatsky postulated the possibility of life on other worlds, and that the ancients were already aware of advanced extraterrestrial creatures. She argued that these creatures had visited the Earth and aided in the evolution of humanity. In the second volume of The Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky stated, quote, "Still the fact remains that most of the planets, as the stars beyond our system, are inhabited, a fact which has been admitted by the men of science themselves. Laplace and Herschel believed it, though they wisely abstained from imprudent speculation, and the same conclusion has been worked out and supported with an array of scientific considerations by C. Flammarion, the well-known French astronomer. When, therefore, we find in the Bibles of humanity other worlds spoken of, we may safely conclude that they not only refer to other states of our planetary chain and Earth, but also to other inhabited globes." End quote. On a side note, unfortunately, it is also in Blavatsky's work that we find the seeds of what has become one of the modern perversions of the hypothesis, namely, the misinformed concept of a reptilian conspiracy. In 1877, under unusual conditions of good seeing, the Italian astronomer Giovanni Schiaparelli observed what appeared to be channels crisscrossing the Martian surface. Schiaparelli never maintained that his channels were relics of alien technology. Yet, The word gained something in the translation into English. Channels became canals, and the connotation of intelligent engineering efforts. This was snapped up by Percival Lowell, an American astronomer who became so devoted to the search for life on Mars that he established an observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona, for the sole purpose of studying the red planet. His two books were widely read: Mars, published in 1896, and Mars and Its Canals, published in 1911. William Scott Elliott was a theosophist who elaborated on Blavatsky's work. In his book, The Lost Lemuria, published in 1904, he claimed that beings on Venus came to Earth and taught the inhabitants of Lemuria the arts of civilization and gave them wheat and fire. Charles Hoy Fort was an American writer and researcher into anomalous phenomena. Today, the term Fortean is used to characterize various such phenomena. In his work, Book of the Damned, published in 1919, Fort wrote, quote, "If other worlds have ever in the past had relations with this earth, they were attempted positivizations to extend themselves by colonies upon this earth, to convert or assimilate indigenous inhabitants of this earth." End quote. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, the father of Russian aeronautics, in 1925 wrote extensively on spaceflight and the possibility of ETs colonizing the galaxy ahead of us. Alien civilizations, he pointed out, might well exist at many different levels of technological development. He summarized by noting the distinct probability that perfection and dominance of the mind have been spreading throughout the cosmos. As we reach the end of the modern era approaching 1950, we have one specific event that we can point to as the source for today's commingling of two different hypotheses, an amalgam, if you will. The Roswell incident of 1947 introduced the public to flying saucers. Of course, some fiction writers had already introduced their readers to such a craft long before the Roswell incident, but this particular event injected the concept of extraterrestrial life into the mainstream of the pop culture. This amalgam effect has, in some cases, created perversions of the ancient astronaut hypothesis that focus very little on the actual past and more on aspects of unidentified aerial phenomena. Throughout the 1950s, the hypothesis found continued development in several works. In 1954, Harold T. Wilkins wrote Flying Saucers from the Moon. 2 years later, in 1956, Morris K. Jessup wrote UFOs and the Bible. In fact, these two works demonstrate one of the older amalgams of the hypothesis, which includes an accounting of modern-day UAP activity. Both works were written within the first 10 years after the Roswell incident. In 1957, Peter Colosimo wrote The Unknown Planet. The following year, in 1958, George Hunt Williamson published Secret Places of the Lion. And in 1958, Henry Lote wrote The Search for the Tassili Frescoes, the story of the prehistoric rock paintings of the Sahara. In 1960, The Morning of the Magicians, written by Louis Pauwels and Jacques Bergener, coupled profound insights into the hidden history of humanity and our perceptions of reality with the scientific evidence that supports the existence of paranormal activity, telepathy, and extraterrestrial communications. Before we analyze what could be considered somewhat of a renaissance period for the ancient astronaut hypothesis beginning in the 1960s, we must first back up just a little bit. In 1849, Sir Austen Henry Layard, English archaeologist and global explorer, found himself among the ruins of ancient Babylon in southern Mesopotamia. It was there he discovered the first pieces of what would eventually become one of archaeology's most controversial puzzles, cuneiform tablets. Within this incredible ancient text are stories that have an uncanny resemblance to the biblical stories of creation, deities, and even a reference to a great flood and a giant ark to survive it. A little more than 150 years later, only a fraction of these tablets has been translated. In the second half of the 20th century, a man that became very well known and respected as an expert in his field made the following observation concerning these Sumerian tablets. Quote, I feel that if Sumerian civilization is depicted by the descendants of the Sumerians themselves to be of non-human origin, the relevant legends should be examined carefully. I do not claim that the following is necessarily an example of extraterrestrial contact, but it is the type of legend that deserves more careful study. Taken at face value, the legend suggests that contact occurred between human beings and non-human civilization of immense powers on the shores of the Persian Gulf, perhaps near the site of the ancient Sumerian city of Eridu, and in the 4th millennium BC, or earlier, end quote. Some of you may have thought this quote was attributed to Zecharia Sitchin, but in fact, these are the words of Carl Sagan. The modern era ended in 1948. With the emergence of the postmodern era came further refinements to the hypothesis that are based both on scientific and archaeological discoveries. Erich von Däniken is a Swiss author of several books about the ancient astronaut hypothesis. His first work, and most popular, was Chariots of the Gods, published in 1968. Von Däniken is one of the main figures responsible for popularizing the paleo-contact theory and is considered to be one of the fathers of the modern ancient astronaut hypothesis. Von Däniken's approach was somewhat novel in that it centered upon pictures from ancient sites that could be seen as resembling contemporary astronauts and objects similar to items reported as unidentified flying objects. While von Däniken may get much of the credit for originating the ancient astronaut hypothesis in its modern form, he was far from its originator as evidenced by the preceding information in this presentation. In the mid-1970s, Zecharia Sitchin's lifelong interest in the archaeology of the Middle East culminated in the book The 12th Planet, published in 1976. The 12th Planet appeared at the height of the ancient astronaut controversy which had been generated by claims of Erich von Däniken that he had discovered evidence of the presence of UFOs and extraterrestrials in the artifacts from various ancient cultures. Mr. Sitchin started with a somewhat different hypothesis, that ancient mythology should be read as historical documents, as reports of actual occurrences. His starting point was the biblical book of Genesis, chapter 6, and the cryptic references to the sons of God marrying the daughters of men and the giants, or Nephilim, who were here on earth in the era prior to the biblical flood. Using a variety of ancient documents, including the Babylonian epic known as the Enuma Elish, he hypothesized the existence of another planet in our solar system, which he named Nibiru, that travels an elliptical orbit that brings it into the area between the orbits of Jupiter and Mars every 3,600 to 3,450 years. The planet is inhabited by a humanoid race called the Anunnaki, who intervened in Earth history to speed the evolution of Homo sapiens. Zecharia Sitchin relied on actual historical text and references to formulate his hypothesis. He draws from cuneiform references that were discovered only about 170 years ago by Austin Henry Layard in the ruins of ancient Babylon. And while his research irritates academics and religious folks alike, it does not necessarily refute either, which is ironic when you consider that his most vocal critics are members of those two groups. Over the course of the next few decades, von Däniken and Sitchin published many more books, and during this time, the number of new authors and researchers of the ancient astronaut hypothesis grew significantly. The late 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed an infusion of the ancient astronaut hypothesis into the pop culture via the fictional works of some of the best-known authors in recent history. However, elements of the hypothesis appeared millennia before in various works of literature. Each of the examples presented here demonstrates one or more tenets of the hypothesis as written or presented in fictional narrative form. In many cases throughout the ancient past, the lines are blurred between what was a work of fiction and what was a work of philosophy, religion, or historical documentation. We have attempted to separate them, but many times they are one and the same. Many of the citations in this part are classified as fiction by mainstream academia, thus their inclusion in this segment. With that said, it is not the archive's position that these citations are in fact wholly fictional without any basis in reality. The viewer may be somewhat surprised at the considerable number of people who contributed to the evolution of the hypothesis in fiction, and keep in mind, this is by far not an exhaustive list. The earliest Sumerian poems are now generally considered to be distinct stories rather than parts of a single epic. They date from as early as the 3rd century of circa 2100 BC. The Old Babylonian tablets circa 1800 BC are the earliest surviving tablets for a single epic of Gilgamesh narrative. The Gilgamesh story tells of a flood, a family of humans that survive it, and contact with gods that came down from the sky. There is an implication that Gilgamesh is a superhuman god-man who was a product of a union between the gods and mortals. He is 2/3 god and 1/3 human, thus suggesting that these unions were going on for several generations. Genesis is perhaps best seen as an example of antiquarian history, a type of literature telling of the first appearance of humans, the stories of ancestors and heroes, and the origins of cultures, cities, and so forth. The oldest manuscripts we have of Genesis date to some point between 150 BC and 70 AD, nearly 2,000 years after the first appearance of Gilgamesh. However, literary research on the Old Testament suggests that the oldest parts of the book of Genesis may have been first written during the 8th century BC. The latest parts and final editing were probably done during the 5th century BC. There are striking similarities between the stories told in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the book of Genesis. Genesis also has a flood story, and prior to this flood, another story tells how part human, part angelic beings called Nephilim came down among humans and fornicated with the women. The offspring became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. While Genesis merely mentions the Nephilim and their association with humans, Gilgamesh appears to be a more detailed story of what was happening during that period in ancient history prior to the flood. Genesis zeroes in on Noah and his family and how they escaped the flood. Gilgamesh includes the flood story at the end of the long epic. In that story, Noah becomes Utnapishtim, who relates to Gilgamesh how he and his family built a ship and escaped the Great Flood. Ancient astronaut hypothesis proponents believe these stories support a concept of alien intervention that utilized genetic manipulation to create the Homo sapien, or modern man. It is contended that visitations by the Nephilim appear to be a description of continued alien contact, and that the genetic manipulation with Earth primates appears to have been a process that went on for many generations. The Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Egyptians, Nubians, Chinese, Persians, Mayans, Aztecs, and Inca, among many others, all have similar examples in their ancient literature that could be interpreted as evidence of extraterrestrial intervention. In fact, examples of these so-called mythological accounts in human cultures throughout history are far too numerous to recount here. Because these historical records are referenced as potential evidence, they have become rather controversial. Essentially, the interpretation of these records as fact or fiction is what fuels the controversy. The Vedas are considered the earliest literary record of Indo-Aryan civilization and the most sacred books of India. They are the original scriptures of Hindu teachings and contain spiritual knowledge encompassing all aspects of life. Vedic literature is the highest religious authority for all sections of Hindus and for mankind in general. And although the Vedas are dated to the 18th century BC, the oral tradition of the Indus Valley extends back more than 7,000 years. In Vedic literature, one finds the predecessors of the flying Vimanas of the Sanskrit epics. Vimanas were the flying chariots employed by various gods. The Ramayana is one of the two epic Hindu poems, the other being the Mahabharata. The Ramayana describes a love story between Rama, an ancient king, and Sita, who is captured by Ravan, the king of Ceylon. Rama lays siege to Ceylon and wins back Sita. In the Ramayana, the Pushpaka Vimana of Ravana is described as follows, quote, "The Pushpaka Vimana that resembles the sun and belongs to my brother was brought by the powerful Ravana, that aerial and excellent Vimana going everywhere at will, that chariot resembling a bright cloud in the sky. And the king got in, and the excellent chariot at the command of the Ragira rose up into the higher atmosphere." End quote. This is the first flying Vimana mentioned in existing Hindu text. The Mahabharata is the other major Sanskrit epic of ancient India. The Mahabharata is an important source of information on the development of Hinduism. It is regarded by Hindus as both a text about Dharma and a literal history. Although the core Mahabharata does not contain mention of Vimanas, there is, however, a wealth of description in the editions thereafter. And a large quantity of these descriptions is in the context of wars between gods. Incredibly, there are detailed descriptions of advanced technologies beyond simple flying machines, spanning from cloaking devices to nuclear weaponry. In 160 AD, the Greek satirist Lucian of Samosata wrote the first interplanetary romance that has survived. In his elaborate true history, Lucian and his fellow travelers are carried by whirlwind to the moon, found to be inhabited by a race of men who ride on the backs of three-headed birds. The famous Roman poet Cicero was interested in the possibility of living beings on the moon, and his works may have inspired Plutarch to write his account of a visit to the moon. In Faces in Orbe Lunar, after dealing with various problems involved in reaching the moon, the Greek historian endorsed the Pythagoreans thus, quote, "They affirm that the moon is terrestrial and inhabited like the earth, people with the greatest living creatures and the fairest plants. It is possible that some inhabitants exist on the moon, and those who claim that these beings must need everything that is necessary to us have never considered the variety that nature offers, so that animals differ amongst themselves more than they differ from inanimate life." End quote. As we move forward, we encounter the same gap in references as discussed in Part 1. For over 1,000 years, including the Dark Ages, there is scant, non-secular reference to the hypothesis. So we jump to the early modern era where we find Ludovico Ariosto. In the work titled Orlando Furioso, which first appeared in 1516, he tells of a trip to the moon using a chariot driven by St. John. The vehicle is drawn by flaming horses who leap from the summit of a high mountain. The moon, it turns out, is littered with cities and townships. In 1638, the first narrative of a trip to the moon written in English was penned by Bishop Francis Godwin. In The Man in the Moon, the main character, Domingo Gonzalez, uses a team of trained geese under harness to carry him to the moon, whereupon Quote, "Suddenly I saw myself environed with a kind of people most strange, both for their feature, demeanor, and apparel. Their stature was most diverse, but for the most part twice the height of ours. Their color and countenance most pleasing, and their habit such as I know not how to express." End quote. By 1640, another book was out, a 2-volume set by English Bishop John Wilkins, entitled The Discovery of a World in the Moon. Wilkins asserted his straightforward belief that it is possible for some of our prosperity to find out a conveyance to this other world, and if there be inhabitants there, to have commerce with them. In 1656, the Jesuit Athanasius Kircher sent his hero touring the heavens with an angel as his guide. In the course of these journeys, the moon was found to be quite habitable, including mountains, oceans, lakes, islands, and rivers. About a decade later, in Milton's well-known Paradise Lost, the angel Raphael discusses the possibility of life on the moon and other planets. Says he of the moon, quote, "Could there not be fields and inhabitants? Her spots thou seest, as clouds and clouds may rain and rain produce, fruits in her softened soil for some to eat, allotted there, and other suns perhaps, with their attendant moons." David Russin, in A Voyage to the Moon in 1703, allowed that there might be inhabitants on the moon, but that traveling there would be difficult because of the lack of air between worlds. Voltaire's characters in Micromegas in 1752 are extraterrestrials. One is a dwarf from Saturn with 72 different senses, and the other is a giant 8 leagues tall from the Sirius star system possessing more than 1,000 different senses. The story is a satire on the supposed intelligence of mankind as it might be evaluated by objective aliens. In 1775, a Frenchman named Louis Guillaume de la Folie published an account of the doings of beings on Mercury. In Philosophy Without Pretension, a brilliant Mercurian inventor-scientist constructs a flying machine which carries a skeptical fellow scientist to Earth and maroons him here. And Herodotus' narrator in his book A Voyage to the Moon in 1793 treks to Luna by hot air balloon landing on an island peopled with bipedal snake-like organisms that speak English. The book caricatures British social and political life by describing the civilization of the man-snakes in a most derogatory fashion. This particular work stands out as one of the earliest depictions of serpent-like extraterrestrials. Gradually, voyages to other stars began to be written. With the French author Charles Ischir de Fontenay, we are transported to the star system of Psi Cassiopeia in his 1854 novel of the same name. Achille Irod's book Voyage to Venus in 1865 was the first fictional visit to that planet at a time when the idea of an inhabited moon was virtually old hat. The Martians in Hugh McCoyle's Mr. Stranger's Sealed Packet, published in 1889, have voice recording devices and electric lighting but are otherwise technologically inferior to Earthlings. In Robert Croney's book, A Plunge into Space, published in 1890, we find the frustrated hopes of finite humans projected onto more advanced aliens. Zero population growth has been achieved, workdays are only 2 hours in length, and the government is so perfect that there is no need for politicians. John Jacob Astor's A Journey in Other Worlds, published in 1894, describes Jupiter's streaming jungles, replete with dinosaurs and pterodactyls, and a brief excursion to Saturn. John Monroe painted a most detailed picture of life on Venus in A Trip to Venus, 1897. Kurd Laswitz's book, titled Concerning Two Planets, published in 1897, is a fascinating tale of Martians who differ little from men physically but are comparatively advanced in ethics, social and physical sciences. Since they are more advanced, Laswitz reasoned they will be the first to visit us and not vice versa. In War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, published in 1898, the interaction of man and alien is explored realistically for the first time. Man must realize that he may someday face enemies with minds that are to our minds as our minds are to the beast in the jungle. We must also learn humility, we discover. In the end, the invaders are destroyed, not by Earth's pitiful military might, but by the lowly bacteria of our own planet against which the aliens have no immunological defenses. In 1905, Lieutenant Gulliver Jones' His Vacation, written by Edwin Lester Arnold, is a fantasy in which we meet carefree, friendly, gracious, but apparently purposeless Martians possessing an ideal political system. In Another Trip to Venus, Garrett Putnam Service's book, A Columbus of Space, published in 1909, we find ape-like cave dwellers and beautiful telepathic humans. Mark Wick's book, To Mars via the Moon, published in 1911, is another enthusiastic depiction of Lowellian Mars. The telepathic Martians are found to have advanced canal-building technology and a utopian socialist system of government. Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote extensively about Venus and Mars in his Barsoom and Venus series, spanning over 3 decades. In 1926, H.P. Lovecraft wrote in his book, The Call of Cthulhu, quote, "Old Castro remembered bits of hideous legend that paled the speculations of the theosophist and made men and the world seem recent and transient indeed. There had been eons when other things ruled on earth, and they had had great cities. Remains of them, he said the deathless Chinaman had told him, were still to be found as cyclopean stones on islands in the Pacific. They all died vast epochs of time before men came, but there were arts which could revive them when the stars had come around again to the right positions in the cycle of eternity. They had, indeed, come themselves from the stars and brought their images with them. When the stars were right, they could plunge from world to world through the sky. But when the stars were wrong, they could not live." End quote. C.S. Lewis also took us to Mars and Venus in his books Out of the Silent Planet in 1938 and Perelandra in 1943. As we move forward, an early example of the idea of directed pans-permia is found in the early science fiction work Last and First Men by Olaf Stapleton, first published in 1930. Switching gears a bit, we find one of America's most beloved fictional icons was born in the 1930s and was directly attached to a modern version of the hypothesis. The origin story of Superman relates that he was born Kal-El on the alien planet Krypton before being rocketed to Earth as an infant by his scientist father Jor-El, moments before Krypton's destruction. The remainder of the late modern era from the 1930s to the late 1940s witnessed a transition of the hypothesis within fiction. The focus increasingly shifted to technological considerations over the romance of space voyage. This was especially true immediately following the Roswell incident, when the term UFO became embedded into the social vernacular. Motion pictures were a relatively new media that significantly increased the exposure of various forms of the hypothesis during this time. Two of the most popular were Flash Gordon in 1936 and Buck Rogers in 1939. Before we close out this episode, we would like to present some examples of the more notable movies and television shows that utilized one or more of the tenets of the ancient astronaut hypothesis from the 1950s onward. This list barely scratches the surface of the genre's content relating to the ancient astronaut hypothesis. It becomes exceedingly difficult to highlight all the examples beginning with the 1980s explosion of alien-related storylines. So, as we wrap this one up, the viewer can see that the basic tenets of the hypothesis did in fact originate in the writing and considerations of learned individuals throughout many segments of society, not just the fictional writers of the 19th and 20th centuries. Second, we can observe that fictional narratives were seemingly the most direct medium to convey various components of the hypothesis to the popular culture without said culture possessing any awareness of the hypothesis' ancient origin. Unfortunately, this has resulted in some rather perverted modern variations of the hypothesis that have very little relevance to its origins. For a significantly huge portion of the pop culture, the entire extent of their knowledge base regarding the ancient astronaut hypothesis is derived solely from movies, television shows, and social media posts. Suffice it to say that the concept of extraterrestrials visiting Earth in our past is now pervasive in today's social fabric across the globe.